Welcome to the warm-up for tonight's national championship game. Monday Night Live, the high upside, aspiring to be viral show all about Notre Dame football from the staff at Inside ND Sports and the Rivals Network. And we dare to overlap the start of the college football national championship game. You can go back and watch the end of us if you can't make it all the way through. Without getting a little peek at the TCU Georgia game. Anyways, I'm Eric Hansen. He's Tyler James, our recruiting writer. Kyle Kelly is just back from San Antonio, so he's kind of unwinding after covering some future Irish players down in the All-American Bowl. We have a lot to cover tonight, including some takeaways from the Sam Hartman commitment, some other things happening in the transfer portal, and we'll take your questions. That segment is coming up, so start filling up the question portal.
Yes, and shout out to Jerry McClurg and Southside Irish for getting questions in before the show started. We appreciate that. Make sure we have some ammunition for our questions as we get going with the show. We appreciate that, as always. Before we get into our topics, we want to make sure to ask you hit the thumbs up to like this video, and also make sure you're subscribed. We are closing in on 1,000 subscribers, and we need your help to get there. The response to last week's video was great, so we're going to keep rolling through the offseason as long as the demand remains. So please keep watching, liking, and sharing these videos with your friends. Before we get into our show plan, Eric, I wanted to get a quick national championship game prediction from you. The game will start before we get done with the show, so I wanted to squeeze that in up top before we get any spoilers before we get into the game.
Well, I'd really like to kind of see TCU win this because it would break so many stereotypes and beliefs that, a team that doesn't recruit top 5 recruiting classes can win the national championship. But I think Georgia's going to win. TCU, I've never seen a team this bad in run defense and total defense win the national championship. They've gotten to this point in the championship game and they've lost all of those. So my prediction is Georgia. If you want to score, I'll say 38-27 Georgia.
All right, we're in the same neighborhood. I was going to go Georgia 41, TCU 31. I think that Georgia's just going to be too much for TCU, but certainly would enjoy seeing if the Horned Frogs can pull off the upset there, because I think that is ultimately good for college football, and we'll see if more of those potential upsets come in the future version of the college football playoff.
Do we have the technology to edit that score for people that watch it later in
the week? We'll see. We'll see how we can do. All right, Eric. Now let's get into your first quick take of the night as we go over some of the top headlines in around Notre Dame football.
Well, we need to start with Wake Forest quarterback Sam Hartman transferring to Notre Dame. He becomes the 5th transfer in this class so far. They're all grad transfers. You could argue that he's the most impactful, potentially the most impactful transfer, certainly in the modern era of Notre Dame football. You'd have to really go back all the way to George Connor in the 1940s after World War II to get a transfer. Now, Notre Dame hasn't had many transfers.
Right.
They've had them here and there, maybe one every few decades. That's a scholarship to scholarship transfer. Then when the grad transfer rule came into play in 2006, it took Notre Dame 8 years before they took one of those. But they started adding transfers early in the 2010s. They added Jordan Prestwood and Amir Carlisle. But again, it was kind of hit and miss. And suddenly now there's all kinds of transfers. But Sam Hartman, when you look at the teams that are getting to the national championship game, getting to the playoff, these are the kind of quarterbacks they have. So, Tyler, I'd like to maybe get your assessment of his potential impact.
Yeah, I mean, it's massive. I think this is the kind of quarterback that you go looking for in the transfer portal and don't necessarily know if you can pull off. But I think this is a big addition for Notre Dame. Now, I think everyone because Caleb Williams happened for USC, everyone wants the next Caleb Williams. I don't know that Sam Hartman's going to go off and win the Heisman Trophy next season. But he is, I mean, he's 2 or 3 steps above what Jack Cohn was, I think, and Jack Cohn had a pretty big impact at Notre Dame, although there was some shaky parts to that season for him. I think it's better to. I think I'm past the point of just hoping. I'm pretty confident that Notre Dame will know how to use Sam Hartman and take advantage of his skill set, whereas I think it took Notre Dame a little bit longer to figure out what to do with Jack Cohn, and I think that was partially related, not partially, mostly related to its offensive line struggles and not maybe anticipating the line being as bad as it was at the start of that 2021 season. So I think this is an extremely important addition for Notre Dame. It's the kind of move you have to make with the uncertainty of, okay, what can Tyler Buchner be for us in 2023? And we'll see how it plays out. I'm interested to get to know Sam Hartman a little bit better, get to talk to him, get to watch him in person more. I guess the last time I saw him in person would have been back in 2018 at Ian Book's start against Wake Forest, and Sam Hartman was the starting quarterback there. So it's been a while since I've been in the same place as Sam Hartman, but we'll be seeing plenty of him moving forward. What are your thoughts on what this turns into for Notre Dame going into the spring?
Well, I will say Sam Hartman is the first quarterback that's ever coaxed me into watching the Gasparilla Bowl, because we had gotten word earlier that morning that this was eventually going to happen. Not might happen, that it would happen. I think that Sam can do a lot of positive things beyond what he does on the football field. You know, he's a natural leader. He's I believe a 3-time captain. He won the Brian Piccolo Award for most inspirational player. I think he'll be good for Notre Dame's young receivers, their young tight ends. I think he'll be good, really good for Tyler Buchner. Where I wonder about the question in my mind, the unknown for me, is how he handles the fishbowl. You know, he's so mentally tough with the things that he's been through in his life. Right. And if you want maybe a longer list of those, listen to last week's emergency podcast with Connor O'Neill. He's got a great backstory on all the things that Hartman has gone through, both at Wake Forest and during his high school career. So really interesting stuff. But I don't know. I mean, sometimes when you step into that broader, those big lights, it's a little bit different, and not because you're deer in the headlights, but more you're critiqued. Everything's critiqued. I mean, people critique your favorite color when you're the Notre Dame quarterback, and he's going to have to be able to shut that noise out. I thought Jack Cohn did that incredibly well, and that's one of the reasons why he was successful, because there was a lot of criticism at the beginning, and I thought he handled it really well. I think Tyler Buchner, to a large extent, is pretty good at shutting it out. Drew Pine had his antenna up a little bit more. He knew what people were saying about him. He knew what was going on Twitter and what people were writing about him. And I think that affected him at points. I think it affected Ian Book at times in his career too.
Sure.
So that would be my question with Sam Hartman. Is he going to be, willing to be the face of this program for a year?
Yeah, it feels like you're belittling Wake Forest by talking about it, but it's real. Like the difference between like what comes with being the Wake Forest starting quarterback and the starting quarterback at Notre Dame is significant. I mean, just the media scrums alone will look differently. I mean, some of the I don't know how many people were showing up at press conferences to Wake Forest games, but I imagine we're going to be outnumbering them pretty significantly with all the different websites and TV stations that cover Notre Dame football. So how does he handle that? How does he figure out his role in that, and how comfortable is he with that? It seemed like from the feedback we got from Connor O'Neill, it seemed like sometimes maybe he wasn't the most comfortable with those kinds of things. And maybe a new change of scenery changes things up for him. Maybe you get tired of talking to the same reporters for 5 years and not wanting to do it for a 6th year. So we won't have that sort of history with him. But obviously we will be curious to know what went into his decision, why he ended up at Notre Dame, and then also be certainly evaluating his game as we move forward, and seeing how he puts things together and how he improves Notre Dame's offense, because that is something that needs to happen this season. Notre Dame's offense, especially its passing game, wasn't good enough for it to compete for the college football playoff, let alone the national championship.
And I'll say this: Jack Cohn did probably, even going from Wisconsin to Notre Dame, and Notre Dame rolled him out there too. I think he did more interviews. He wasn't typically super insightful, but he was willing to do it. He was pleasant to deal with.
Right.
It was hard sometimes to get underneath some of the layers with him, but sometimes you could get there with him. But he was certainly friendly and amicable to it, and was okay with, the criticism. And he kind of, sometimes was self-deprecating and would poke fun of his, running ability. And he won me over. I thought he was really good for Notre Dame. He was, and improved. I mean, almost lost his job kind of halfway through the season.
Right.
You think of that Virginia Tech game, the announcers were proclaiming Tyler Buchner as the number one quarterback during that game. And then he came back with that 2-minute drill late in the game to, put Notre Dame ahead and win the game. And I think, they got to a bye week, and Brian Kelly was able to, and Tommy Rees were able to kind of recalculate the formula of what made him good.
So speaking of trying to figure out what makes someone good and getting the best out of them, what do you think this does for Tyler Buchner's future? How does this play out for him? What does it look like for him moving forward? How can he make the most out of this situation?
Well, I think first of all, there needs to be a split, at least at the beginning of spring, of reps with the number ones. I think you have to develop Tyler Buchner as well as Sam Hartman. The team needs to see on the field that Sam Hartman is the better quarterback, and I think they will. And Tyler Buchner needs to see that too. I asked Tyler about them bringing in back in December about them bringing in a transfer portal quarterback after Drew Pine had left, and he said, I get it. We need more bodies here, but he was determined that he thinks he could be the starting quarterback in August against Navy. Now that was before he knew it was Sam Hartman.
Right.
So again, I think that provided that Tyler Buchner stays at Notre Dame, I think this is maybe the best thing that could happen for him, because he'll be able to develop at a pace that's good for him with a quarterback that has a lot of his same skills and that's the same size. I mean, they're both about 6'1", 210, 215 range. And I think he can learn a lot of great habits. I think Jack Cohn was good for Tyler Buchner too, in a different way, but very different skill set, different sized player. So, that's kind of where I see it with Tyler Buchner going now. Again, he could elect to, after spring say, I'd like to be a starter in 2023. The good thing about the longness of the layoff for him is he only played in 3 games. So he gained back a year of eligibility. So he would have eligibility in 2023, 2024, 2025. So it's not like the clock is ticking and he's never going to get that chance. But then 2024 really is kind of his window where he needs to step up and benefit from this year of being the backup, and maybe a niche player too. Maybe there are situations where you would use Tyler Buchner in the red zone or some, maybe there's some other situations where it makes sense.
Yeah. And I mean, if he's considering leaving, he has to figure out, okay, what are my options in that? Is everyone already sort of filled out what they would anticipate being like,
Right.
They're starting going into next season? Like, are there any like obvious openings there that if Tyler Buchner came into, he would be the clear front runner to be a starting quarterback? Now, I'm sure there are plenty of college football programs that he would fit that bill for, but are they the type of programs that Tyler Buchner wants to play in? Are they going to be competing at a high level? And is it worth the risk of making a leap to a school like that when potentially, if things work out well for you and you sit behind Sam Hartman for a season, then you become the starter at Notre Dame in a good situation where the talent pool around the quarterback at Notre Dame seems to be trending upward. It's not like Notre Dame's there's going to be a huge drop off in talent around the quarterback after the 2023 season. It seems like it's only going to continue to get better. So that could even be putting Tyler Buchner in a better position than he was going into this past season as the starter, because the offense, as we learned and had a pretty good hunch that some of the passing game pieces there weren't necessarily going to be ready to be big time yet, although we thought maybe some of them, like Lorenzo Styles, would be more big time than they ended up being. But I think there's a way that Tyler Buchner can sort of see this through, even if he doesn't beat out Sam Hartman, which I think would be very difficult to do, and still be on a good trajectory to reach his potential as a quarterback at Notre Dame.
Right. What would be the most likely scenario if he were going to go shopping? Because again, there's been so much quarterback movement in December and January as opposed to other years, but it would probably be a situation where someone lost their quarterback long-term for injury with a spring injury, where they wouldn't be back until maybe the middle or the end of the season. And that would create the kind of opening. But you're right.
Yeah, or they could take like a guy and say, well, actually, this guy isn't nearly as good as we thought he was coming in for spring practice. Now let's go ahead and replace him one semester later. That I don't think you can rule that out either.
Not in this day and age.
Right.
So as far as the younger quarterbacks, I don't really think it changes their trajectory. Angeli wasn't, I don't think, going to be in the mix to start, especially had Drew Pine stayed. Although a lot of people would love to see him play and make that decision for themselves. Kenny Minchie, he skipped the All-American Bowl. He had a minor shoulder injury or I guess it was a shoulder injury. It seems to be his condition now isn't fully 100%, but whatever's going on with his shoulder is supposed to be not a big concern. So he would get some reps, but I mean, he wasn't looking to start. And then CJ Carr is still, arriving in the spring of 2024 before the 2024 season. And this would still put him on track to, be competing for the job in 2024, but probably not the favorite to win it, because there would be some pretty good alternatives. So this seems like it doesn't interrupt the development of those young quarterbacks at all.
No, it doesn't. I mean, I think you wonder, it's like, well, if it's taken Tyler Buchner this long to get there, like if you're Steve Angeli, it's like, well, can I eventually beat out Tyler Buchner, or will I just be stuck behind him anyways once he becomes the starter? And is that worth me waiting to get to just to become the backup? And what are his options too? Obviously he doesn't have any sort of film out there on him for college performance.
Not throwing the ball. He's got one asking for the snap and Mitchell Evans running in front of him and then taking the snap.
Yeah. So there's not a lot there for him to sort of put out there. So, I mean, I think he could, there's a world where he has some sort of transcendent next season as a backup and passes up Tyler Buchner. I mean, there's no guarantee that doesn't happen. Right. So I think you just sort of keep working at your craft and try to get better and sort of take the same sort of lessons from Sam Hartman that Tyler Buchner would have the opportunity to take from him. So I don't see it being too much of an issue. I mean, eventually it will become an issue depending on who becomes that starting quarterback in 2024 and figuring out how that plays out. Because if Tyler Buchner becomes the starting quarterback, what are the odds that he's just the starting quarterback for one season? That doesn't seem very likely, unless things go poorly for him. So I think there's decisions that will have to be made at some point, but that's the reality of quarterbacks in college football recruiting across the country. You're going to have to take a gamble on yourself and figure out what your window is for playing. And if you're not satisfied with that, consider what your other options are.
Absolutely.
All right. What is your next headline for today, Eric?
My next headline is Notre Dame is more active in the transfer market than ever before. And I didn't use the word portal because it's only been called the portal for the last few years. So they've gotten 5 in the last month. The most previously was the 2022 cycle when they got 4, also matched in 2020 when they got 4. I think people forget about Trevor Spates because he never played it down for Notre Dame. He was an injury hardship 3 months after he committed to Notre Dame. And again, I mean, you give the staff a little bit of a pass on that because it was hard to bring people in for visits. You didn't even know if there was going to be a 2020 season because of the pandemic. But again, Marcus, since he's been the head coach, there have been 9 transfers and only 13 before that, going back to the start of the grad transfer era, which was 2006. You know, we can talk about this. How active does Notre Dame need to be? Is that still active enough? And that's what I'll ask you in just a second. But one of the reasons they're doing it more is there are more players and there are better players. You look at tonight's game between Georgia and TCU. Georgia has 6 transfers total on the roster. I don't think any of them transferred in this last cycle. 4 4-year to 4-year college transfers, 2 junior college transfers. TCU has 37. They have 25 and 12, 25 4 to 4-year transfers, 12 junior college transfers. So those teams are built, you know, obviously differently. But from your standpoint, Tyler, you know, what's kind of your thought about what's the right number, what's the right approach to the portal thing? Because I think fans are antsy. They see USC,
right,
and they think, well, I'll tell you, if Caleb Williams wasn't one of them, that USC situation looks a lot different because some of the wide receivers don't come to,
right,
and Caleb makes up for a lot of warts on that team.
Yeah, and I think you look, if you looked at USC's like total list of transfers, I'm sure there's a good chunk of them that didn't do anything or what didn't turn out to be much. And in the situation that Notre Dame's in, where there wasn't a major overhaul of the program and a bunch of guys leaving. If you're bringing that many guys in, some guys have to leave. You're not, unless you take a really small recruiting class, which I don't think it would be wise to do. You're going to have guys sort of filter out of the program as well. And that's something that Notre Dame is sort of tackling now. And it's getting, I think it's probably more uncomfortable for people that have been around Notre Dame and aren't really used to like saying, okay, we need to get, 10 guys out of here between now and the end of or the start of fall camp. How do you figure that out? I mean, I think you'd be transparent with guys about their position in the program and their position on the depth chart. But if a guy wants to stay at Notre Dame, are you willing to say, well, you can stay here, but you're not going to be a football scholarship player? That's a tough conversation to have. And I think it brings a more like professional aspect to the sport that I don't know that a lot might be saying too much, but I'm sure some college football fans aren't comfortable with that. That's a different way of operating than you're used to. It's supposed to be Notre Dame sells a 4 for 40 decision. Well, if you made a 4 for 40 decision, shouldn't you at least get the 4? Yeah. And if you don't get that, what are you selling me a bill of goods that isn't actually what the reality is? So I think that it is complicated, and I think Notre Dame, because of what it sells and what it has as a university, that kids come here to graduate, and if guys are going to be put in positions where they don't think they can graduate and need to get out of here, then that becomes a little bit uncomfortable, and then you have to sort of figure out your way through that and how sustainable is that long term. Do you get into more sticky situations the more you try to turn over the roster? So I think Notre Dame needs to be aggressive in sort of figuring out what its options are, but it also needs to make the right choices. I still think for a long-term plan, I don't know that you can constantly rely on the transfer portal. Unless you really don't trust your coaching and developing model, then I think you have to. But I think if you trust who you have and the way you can make players better, I think you're better off sort of bringing in guys as high school recruits, bring in top level recruits, and develop those guys and figure out how to do that. I mean, even if you just look back at all the grad transfers that Notre Dame brought in, there's a pretty significant list of those guys that you're like, oh, I don't even remember what that guy did at Notre Dame.
Yeah.
Because those are guys that have already, I mean, they've had years of footage on them. They know what those guys are. Usually a lot of times, and you still see this. I mean, even Thomas Harper, the safety / nickelback that Notre Dame's bringing in from Oklahoma State, he had an injury this past season. You usually are bringing in guys that have had injuries or have reasons to leave their program. Now, there are still plenty of guys that will be taking like a step up in competition and want to make themselves better, or are leaving a bad coaching situation or stuff like that. But there's going to be guys that there's going to be a lot of question marks with coming into your program. So those guys, there's no necessary guarantee that those guys are going to hit at a higher rate than your recruits are. So I think you have to find the right balance there. And I think, I mean, it'd be lovely if you could recruit to the level Georgia does, and then you don't have to bring in as many transfers.
Right.
But I don't know that Notre Dame can quite get to there, but I think you can get closer to where Georgia is. And not have to constantly rely on the transfer portal, especially because of Notre Dame's limitations in the transfer portal. I think it's for the foreseeable future. I think it's still going to be taking more grad transfers than it's going to take undergrad transfers. We're not going to see that sort of flip overnight at Notre Dame. And until that does, I think you have to be careful in what you're bringing into your program and how you're evaluating those guys and sort of choose your spots wisely.
Right. I think you have to make sure that you're just plugging holes, that you're not overdoing it. We don't know yet the long term of effect of team chemistry and so forth at these places that brought in so many grad transfers. I mean, everybody has good team chemistry when they're winning. Could a team full of grad transfers survive Notre Dame's 0-2 start? Would there have been some bickering in the locker room? Would they have stuck together as well as they did?
Right.
But, you know, I think Notre Dame's got a pretty good handle on it. I think you also have to make sure that you're not inhibiting the development of some of your younger players. I'll give you, for example, and you covered this potential transfer a lot, and that's Scott Pagano from Clemson, and Notre Dame didn't end up getting him. And had he come, I don't know that Jerry Tillery would have gotten the opportunity he did. I think that was his junior year, and then he became an All-American his senior year. But that might have held Jerry back, or he might have even transferred had Scott Pagano come in. And then Scott had some injury problems at Oregon, but didn't do anything there. Wasn't anywhere near the player he was at Clemson. And Jerry Tillery goes on to become an All-American. So if you bring in, you know, let's say 2 defensive tackles, I think Notre Dame needs to bring in 1. But if you bring in 2, then are you slowing Tyson Ford down a little bit? So I think that's interesting. So when you mentioned Thomas Harper from Oklahoma State, he's a safety with nickel skills. So it'd be interesting. Do you think he's going to be more of a replacement for Tariq Bracy, more of a body to replace the snaps of Brandon Joseph and Houston Griffith, or a little bit of both?
I think probably a little bit of both. I think you just bring him in and figure it out. I think you like his versatility there. And when you talk about some of the guys he's competing with, Ramon Henderson sort of is in the same boat, a different body type, but the same sort of idea where he could play nickel, he could play safety, and has been asked to do some of that at Notre Dame. I think Thomas Harper could be in that position as well. And maybe Ramon Henderson is a nickel in weeks where you got better tight ends or bigger slot receivers, and Thomas Harper is a nickel when you got smaller receivers in the slot. So I think there's different ways you can attack that. I think it sort of falls in line with Notre Dame's philosophy of liking the versatility. Al Golden really values that, and the ability to mix and match players and put them in different spots, eliminates some predictability in the defense. So I think I'll be interested to see what he can do for Notre Dame. we're not talking about like an all Big 12 player coming to Notre Dame from Oklahoma State. He had finally cracked his way into the starting lineup this season. Started 7 games, all 7 games that he was healthy for. I haven't been able to track down exactly what his injuries were, what sort of injuries he was dealing with, but hopefully we get some clarity on that. He was sometimes effective, sometimes ineffective. I like to look through Twitter and just see like what fans are saying of those teams, because they're the most familiar with them, and obviously we know that you're going to get a lot of negativity sometimes if something bad happens in a game about a guy. But I think he had some good moments and some bad moments for Oklahoma State, and we'll see what Notre Dame could do to sort of put him in a position to help them, because I think they do need help at the safety and nickelback roles. Does Jaden Mickey emerge as a nickelback that you have a lot of confidence in? Then maybe you go with that. But I think it's worth taking. I think they needed to take one safety potential guy, and then as we see DJ Brown just deciding to come back for a 6th year, that sort of answers that they're probably not going to take another safety. And it sort of makes sense of the numbers. You like what Xavier Watts and Ramon Henderson are in their development. DJ Brown has a ton of experience, and then you bring in Thomas Harper. So you have 4 guys there that can play safety and have some experience there. And then you have certainly the freshman class coming in that you don't really want to have to rely on those guys. If Peyton Bowen was one of them, then maybe you don't go after the portal guy, or maybe you don't ask DJ Brown to come back for a 6th year. But once that ship sailed, it sort of underlined the need to sort of go for another defensive back with some safety skill sets to bring into the program.
This show is so versatile. We're able to run our version of the mesh offense. We've meshed category number 2 with headline number 3, which is a safety dance. We'll finish up category number 2. And Tyler, if we want to mix in some questions at some point, and if you have a question, you haven't submitted it yet, get in the portal now and we'll take a look at your question. But the last part of the second segment is where might Notre Dame still add? And there was a defensive end, Byron Vaughn's, on campus this weekend. So where do you think they may still add?
Yeah, I think obviously defensive line is a need there. That was underscored with Justin Adamalola leaving the program and entering into the NFL draft rather than coming back for a 6th year. I still think the need is high, probably both on the inside and the outside, if depending on what you can get. If you get maybe a Viper and a field end, I think you're happy with that. If you can get a Viper and a defensive tackle, I think that would be of interest too. So sort of depends on what the options are there. I don't know. There's a lot of other names besides Byron Vaughn's, the Utah State defensive end that you mentioned, that was on campus this past weekend. Anthony Lucas being a name that was sort of interesting as someone that Notre Dame recruited, but I haven't heard of any serious momentum for Notre Dame there yet. Jordan
Sounds
Dominic,
like he's kind of leaning to USC.
Yeah, USC and Arizona State, I think, had some confidence in potentially getting him maybe too. Jordan Dominic was a recent addition to the transfer portal, I think within the last week or so, out of Arkansas. So that would be a guy I would be interested in seeing if Notre Dame can make work. He's a defensive end. Wide receiver is still on the shopping list. Notre Dame's been poking around on CJ Williams, the former Notre Dame commit who went to USC and now is in the portal. His first visit was to Wisconsin, so I don't know that is very realistic for Notre Dame. Michigan wide receiver Andrew Anthony was a guy that Notre Dame recruited out of high school. So some familiarity there. Cal wide receiver J. Michael Sturdivant is a noteworthy name there, but nothing to report necessarily in terms of like this is going to be the next guy that Notre Dame makes a real good run at. The other position that I'm sort of watching is offensive line. I'm not ruling out the possibility of Notre Dame finding an interior player that it likes there, that they may be interested in pursuing there. So we'll keep folks updated.
I don't like that. Not your prediction of it, but if they did it, I don't like that.
Well, I mean, I guess You should probably figure out who it is first. Like if it's Kane Madden, then you don't like it. But if it's someone really good, then maybe you can like it. I don't know what that is.
I just think you may have multiple people hit the portal themselves if they don't give them a chance at that opening, because I think there's some really good talented guys that Notre Dame's recruited and developed that deserve that chance.
Right, and I think you go into that knowing that that's possible, and maybe Notre Dame feels that there's going to be guys heading to the portal anyways, regardless of what they do, or if the guy's that much better than what you have, I think you can't rule yourself out there, especially if you're going to be. If you are so good at recruiting offensive linemen, if you get a transfer out or two, I think you should be able to replace those guys with young guys in the future. So, and it's not like Notre Dame doesn't have numbers at offensive line in the lower classes. So, we'll see what happens there. We'll keep folks updated with names of note on the Insider Lounge first. That's where we like to give our information first before we come on here and talk about it. So, some of the stuff that we're discussing here maybe have already been discussed on our message board, but that's the perks of being an Inside ND Sports subscriber. Let's get the defensive line. Was a question that Jerry McClurg asked. I have read that the defensive line for next year looks to be a weakness. Will ND be able to get help there in the portal? I don't know what your thoughts on any of those names that I threw out, or Notre Dame's chances of getting that, and how important of a need do you think that is, Eric?
Well, I don't know that I would say it's a weakness, but it's got so much unknown about it. I think,
right.
We're still wondering what a, talent developer Al Washington is. I don't know that we got a clear view of it last year, but there weren't a lot of guys where you said, boy, he turned so-and-so around. Look, and it seemed, I think the red flag for me with the development thing was there were some high caliber defensive line recruits, and it's typically, even under Mike Elston, it's a position group where not a lot of freshmen typically get on the field. But the fact that you didn't hear a lot about Tyson Ford or Aiden Gobira, Joshua Burnham very much, and Donovan Heinisch as well, that bothered me a little bit. I thought there'd be at least one of those guys that they would talk about, wow, he didn't play a lot this year, but wait till next year. So I'm really eager to see all four of those guys and junior Tuli Alamaka make some surges in the spring. And maybe it's a position where they go get an interior guy. If they don't find the match they want, go get an interior guy in the May 1st through 15th portal group, the kind of the post-spring practice group, and add to it then. There's guys like Jordan Botello and Riley Mills where you say, boy, they may be just on the verge of really being good. But again, it's if instead of, Howard Cross is kind of the one guy that, jumps out and you say, Howard Cross is going to be pretty good next year. I mean, I would expect Mills and Botello to be, but you just don't really know. And then are you an injury away at their positions from being in trouble? And that's where I think the portal can help.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's something that Notre Dame is evaluating and is aware of, that it has some questions there. I'm not as concerned that we didn't hear a ton about those freshmen, because I don't know that it's not like there was a ton of playing time available for them. And I also, the conversations that we have with someone like Al Golden, he doesn't usually volunteer up information like that unless you sort of poke him specifically for it. And I don't know how many times any of the freshman defensive linemen came up, but I think that that wasn't a big concern to me. But you actually were the ones that you actually ended up talking to Al Golden more frequently than I did. So what are your thoughts?
I was the Al Golden transcriber. He'd hint at it. I did ask him some. From his standpoint, he seemed to be the most encouraged about Ford out of those guys that didn't play. I'm not including Junior in that. He likes Junior a lot, and Junior played a couple positions. So Junior played some this year. But I think I asked them and grouped them all together, and Tyson Ford was the answer that got spit out of that group. Now he doesn't seem to be, but I don't think he's going to get up there and say, "Wow, Al Washington needs to get it going here."
Right.
But the fact that they are not, really encouraged by some of the players that we haven't heard. He brought up Jason Anye before, but again, Jason Anye, I think, played one snap. Gabe Rubio stepped into a more prominent role. Aiden Kiana, as long as his health holds up, he's an interesting guy. I mean, that's a big nose guard at 322. So that gives you a very different look than what Howard Cross gives you at the position.
Right.
So again, there's some potentials and possibilities. And I guess and I'm not trying to be down on Washington, but if Mike Elston was coaching, I'd have more confidence in those kind of players taking a step up. I hope I'm being fair to Al in saying that, but again, I think on
your history and resume, like you've seen Mike Elston work for much longer than you've seen Al Washington. So Al Washington would have to be spectacular, I think, in his 1 year that we've covered him for us to like have the same sort of confidence in that, because just the length of time that we've known him is so much shorter than Mike Elston was at Notre Dame.
Well, and we also got to see Elston a lot in action. That when they used to practice in the Loftus Center indoors in the spring, they put the media up on this balcony, and the defensive linemen were right near us, so we could see everything they were doing. We could hear everything that was going on, and I gained a lot of respect for Mike Elston and what he was able to do. Just kind of watching those practices. Now, when we watch them, the defensive line is pretty far away from our new balcony perch. You can be kind of on the 50-yard line, but they're usually at one of the ends of the field, so you don't see much with them.
But even when we did get the exposure to practice and the ability to move around, and you could go by the defensive line a little bit closer, it's usually the most boring part of practice for them. Like they're doing the least interesting stuff. So it's like, well, I'm not going to spend my time watching these guys when there's other stuff, more interesting stuff going on in the very small window that we got. So
yeah, they have some contraption where they're kind of on their knees and they just kind of hit it with their arms. And I thought, okay, that's not real interesting. Let's go watch the quarterbacks.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. We wanted to see as much as the quarterbacks as we could back then. I have another question here from Southside Irish that I referenced earlier as thanking that person for submitting, and it's not related to any topic that we'll get to, so I figured might as well throw it in now. Do you know if Eli Raridon will return to play next fall? And he is asking with regards to his injury status, not as if like Eli Raridon doesn't want to be at Notre Dame anymore.
Correct. So he suffered an ACL tear. I want to say he was 5 games into the season, so it would have been in early October. And the last time he suffered an ACL tear, he came back lightning fast, and then suffered another one. So I wouldn't expect him to be able to do anything but maybe run in the spring. But as far as being back in the fall, absolutely, that's a very good timetable for him to be back. I mean, you would figure he'd be able to do some things in the summer and then take contact in August. Kevin Bauman is in a similar timeline, in a similar injury, but everybody's different in terms of their recovery and so forth. But I think they're counting on both those guys to be in the mix with Mitchell Evans and Holden Stays and Davis Sherwood and Cooper Flanagan. I mean, it's going to be kind of an exciting time to see which of those guys becomes the alpha tight end. And I think Eli Raridon has a chance to be that guy.
Yeah, I think given that he had back-to-back injuries like that, I would want there to be some extra precaution there to make sure that, hey, let's not rush this. But I mean, if the doctors clear you and you're good to go, there's that's sort of the protocol there. So I would imagine he'll be back to play and in time for the season. But we can't say that for certain. And maybe we'll get a better insight in the next coming months of how his recovery is going and how things are progressing. But even then, sometimes you don't really know until you get towards those late stages in the rehab of how you're handling the workload being built back up and the strength and flexibility that's required to get back out there with the knee injury.
The interesting thing about Eli in the 5 games in which he did play was that he was a pretty good blocker, which was not necessarily expected of him. We thought he'd be kind of more of a detached receiver, but it was hard for anybody to be anything with Michael Mayer as good as he was. If you were a good sidekick, that was what they were looking for from the other tight ends.
Well, all right, let's keep things rolling here. If you have questions, please submit them soon. We're probably not going to go too much into overtime because I'm sure you, like us, want to watch the national championship game. Eric, live update: Georgia has won the toss, so important information there, and is deferred to the second half. So that is where things stand in the national championship game. But let's move on to what you had termed as our recruiting reset. Where do you want to take us first there with talking a little bit of Notre Dame football recruiting?
Yeah, let's start at the All-American Bowl. Notre Dame had 5 players that played in the game. It was a very one-sided game with the East beating up on the West. Notre Dame had players on both of those teams. There were a couple other players that were supposed to play in the game that had injuries, and that was that came to the game actually and were cheerleaders, and that was Rico Flores, a wide receiver who's enrolling early, and Charles Jaguza, who is an offensive lineman who is going to be joining the team in June. And then Kenny Minchie, a quarterback, was originally selected for that, and he wasn't able to play, and he did not come to San Antonio, nor did Boubacar Traore, who's from Massachusetts. He was hurt basically from September on with his high school team, and he did not make it to San Antonio. There wasn't a lot of great highlights for the Notre Dame team. Or Notre Dame players. I don't know that that's a bad thing when you kind of look over past All-American games. There's been, the one I covered 100 years ago, there were 15 players at that All-American Bowl. That was with Kyle Rudolph and Michael Floyd and Dane Christ and that whole group. There were players there that showed out very well for Notre Dame that did nothing at Notre Dame, and vice versa. So you can't always tell. I would say Brennan Vernon had probably the best All-American game with a one-handed interception. Tyler, I don't know how much of that game you got a chance to see.
I did not watch the game itself much. I was watching some of the highlights that Kyle was sending us throughout the week.
Right.
And Brennan Vernon, not surprisingly, I think he was the most intriguing guy of those guys that were playing. If Kenny Minchie were there, that was someone we wanted to see more of, but that didn't turn out. I would love to see Brennan Vernon as an early enrollee. I think it's a shame that he's not. Now, I don't blame him for not being that, but just from a Notre Dame's perspective and seeing what he could do and potentially getting into the mix this next season. When we're talking about question marks on the defensive line, why not throw someone in there who's got sort of a college-ready body, and put him in the mix there? And I like his sort of attitude. He's an interesting kid, and his sort of weight fluctuation was interesting because there was a point there I was like, well, there's no, from seeing him, he just sort of kept getting bigger. I was like, well, there's no way he's a defensive end anymore. Like, I know we're listing him as a defensive end, but he has to end up being a defensive tackle at Notre Dame. And then he lost a bunch of weight and looked really good this past week at the All-American Bowl down there in San Antonio. So I think whether or not guys make highlights in the game, I don't think is a big deal. I mean, it'd certainly be encouraging to see that, like, say if Notre Dame ended up getting Dante Moore looked pretty good. I did see some of his highlights as the quarterback in that game. So I think if you ever wondered why Notre Dame was so gung-ho about pushing for him, I think it probably became painfully clear, if it wasn't already clear to you previously, of why that the interest in him was so high and why Notre Dame prioritized him, because he he looks like the real deal, and we'll see what ends up becoming of his career starting out at UCLA.
Right. Micah Bell was out there, a cornerback, got beat on a couple plays. Drake Bowen, linebacker, played in the game. Sullivan Absher, an offensive lineman. We mentioned Brendan Verner. Who am I forgetting, Tyler? There were 5 of them.
Adon Schuler.
Adon Schuler, who played safety. So those were the 5 that were at that game. So let's roll from that into the focus moving to the 2024 class. Notre Dame right now is ranked number 2 behind Georgia. Notre Dame has 7 commits, and 5 of them are offensive players right now. LSU is right behind Notre Dame. And then it's interesting because there's going to be a big junior day this weekend. And I can remember when the junior day was kind of the kickoff for the new cycle, where you really were.
You'd finally learn about new names. And now it's all guys.
All guys that you already know well about because the recruiting calendar's moved up so much. But what do you feel like the significance of a junior day is now in, January, February area where it normally is? It's January this year. So what do you think is the significance of that?
I think it is significant, especially for Notre Dame, because getting a kid on campus for a junior day, like in January, is a really honest look at what it's like actually like at Notre Dame. It's not just the glitz and glamour of a game day. Like you're walking into snow potentially. It's not the most happening time on campus in January. Whereas, like if you get here on a Saturday in the fall, it's a magical place. And now, obviously, that's part of what you're selling to Notre Dame, to these recruits. But I think it's helpful for them to see what it's actually like. And I don't have like any sort of data to support this, but I think Notre Dame tends to do pretty well with, like, if they're in a good position with guys and then they get them back on campus for a junior day, that's probably a pretty good sign that those guys are going to end up in Notre Dame's class in the long run. Unless things go turn a different way, those are really good opportunities to get some extra time with the coaching staff when they're not busy with games and stuff like that, and get around campus, get around the team, because the players aren't in like a high stress situation or getting ready to play a game or having just played a game. So I think it's a good opportunity for kids to get a real honest look at what Notre Dame's program is like in as a whole, and not like Notre Dame's being dishonest when they're visiting at other times, but it's not always as nice as it is when you're on an official visit in the middle of June or you're on campus for a game in the fall. So I think it's definitely valuable. That I mean, the name of the game is getting guys on campus. That's never going to change. Any opportunity Notre Dame can get someone on campus is an important one. So you'd like to see some of those Midwest guys get here because that's easier for them to get on campus, but that it's harder. Sometimes it's harder to pull those guys because maybe it's an opportunity that they can go to warmer weather and almost be like a bit of a mini vacation to go somewhere else for a visit for a junior day. So there's lots of competition in terms of when you can get guys on campus and when other schools are hosting recruits. But Notre Dame's working to put together a list of guys that'll include both current commits and targets that it really likes a lot onto campus this weekend. And Kyle Kelly, once he shakes off some of the All-American Bowl work from his notebook, we'll get into covering that and getting into who's coming onto campus, and then once they get here and once they leave, where Notre Dame stands with those guys moving forward.
Right. Then the one good thing about it being this weekend is the 12 early enrollees will all be on campus moving into their dorms and stuff for spring semester. Classes at Notre Dame start a week from Tuesday. And then the transfers will be there as well, the 5 transfers. So they'll get to presumably meet Sam Hartman, which I think would be kind of fun for recruits, especially wide receiver recruits coming in. So that's the junior day thing. And maybe they, honestly, the weather for the next 2 weeks in South Bend is kind of not too bad. So they shouldn't be a knock wood. There shouldn't be like a blizzard or 40-degree wind chill below zero.
Yeah, that always helps, and it makes it easier for the guys to get in travel wise too, because sometimes the weather itself can just prevent the travel from happening, let alone the sort of enjoyment of the visit once you get here.
Absolutely. So we want to go to the fifth headline.
Yeah, let's get our last headline in here before we get out of here and watch some more football.
Last call for questions too. Michael Stonebreaker selected to the 2023 College Football Hall of Fame class. He is the 55th member, most of any school, to be elected to the College Football Hall of Fame. I'll tell you, the threshold is incredibly high for players, not so much for coaches. I mean, Paul Johnson is in this class, and I think of him as
Mark Richt too. It's like Mark Richt, huh? Like, yeah, Georgia's where it's at because Mark Richt is no longer there.
Right. I thought, you could be a, average to above average coach and make it to the Hall of Fame, but man, it's very high threshold for players. So Stoney getting in is amazing. I know that you were not able to watch Mike Stonebreaker unless you were a football prodigy.
I was a prodigy, but not at -1 or 1. So I wasn't quite watching Michael Stonebreaker highlights at being born in 1989. So I've learned plenty about him in covering Notre Dame, but certainly don't have any memory of him from that time. But wrote about him, and obviously had a pretty impressive career with some interruptions in it, but being a two-time All-American and being on that national championship team in 1988, he's joining teammates Rocket Ishmael and Chris Zorich in the Hall of Fame, and head coach Lou Holtz is in the Hall of Fame, and also defensive coordinator Barry Alvarez from that team is also in the Hall of Fame from his time as a head coach at Wisconsin. So some good representation from that 88 national championship team.
Yeah, well, Michael Stonebreaker sounds like a name that you change your name to, that you're not
right
with.
Yeah, that's a Hollywood name. That's not, it's like that's what some script writer made, and it's like, wait a minute, you really got a linebacker named Stonebreaker? It's like, sure do. So
he was 6 foot, about 226 when he played. Played in 1986, then he had to sit out because of academics. Played in 1988 on the national title team, then missed the 89 season because of injuries sustained in a car accident. He had a dislocated hip and a broken kneecap. Then came back and played in 90, and he was awesome. I mean, as you mentioned, All-American in the 88 and 90 years, was third in the Butkus Award both of those years. And he didn't get drafted very high. In fact, that round doesn't even exist anymore. The 9th round by the Bears. Played a season with them, played a bit with New Orleans Saints, and then had a year in the European League with Frankfurt Galaxy. But a heck of a college football player. That's why I'm glad you don't take into the pro into that. It really is how they are in college. And Michael Stonebreaker was a heck of a college player. I'm not sure how his game would translate into today's football. Really downhill kind of player. At the combine ran almost a 4.9 40, which probably
that's
doesn't.
Offensive lineman now.
yeah, probably doesn't cut it in these days. But man, I mean, one of my favorite players for Notre Dame to watch. I came to the South Bend Tribune in 1988, so I got to see him play quite a bit, and then his comeback story in 1990.
Yeah, that 90 season, he had some big plays too, with the interception against Michigan and an interception against Michigan State. And so when you talk about, like, he probably wouldn't translate to today's game, but intercepting passes as a linebacker back then was a pretty big deal too. Yeah. So a fumble recovery against Miami. So he had a big season. He was a unanimous All-American that season. So plenty of accolades. And I think some people were shocked that he wasn't already in the College Football Hall of Fame that are Notre Dame fans, because of how good of a career he did have at Notre Dame.
Yeah, I would imagine he won't be the last player from that 1988 team to make it. But again, that there's so few guys get through the threshold so high that it takes a lot of them a long time to get through. I remember Tom Gatewood told me that he had given up when he finally got in, not on the 88 team. I mean, just a Notre Dame player,
Right.
who he was shocked when he got in, just because, not that he didn't think he deserved it, but he thought they kind of forgot and moved on past him. So
yeah. And Notre Dame is 55 members that will be in the Hall of Fame, with Stonebreaker being the 55th. 49 of them are players and 6 of them are coaches. So
and all 6 of those coaches, I bet, are better than Paul Johnson and Mark Richt.
I think that's probably a safe bet. All right. Well, that's all we got for today. We really appreciate everyone who has tuned in live, and we appreciate all of you who will watch this on replay as well. Hopefully there are plenty of you checking back because you were watching the Georgia TCU game. And we don't blame you for that. I won't keep talking much longer because we want to get there as well, and pay attention to that. Barring a change of plans, we'll be back here next week for another Monday Night Live. We'll have an Inside ND Sports podcast later this week, like usual. And we're always on the Inside Lounge message boards and producing content for InsideNDSports.com. So if you ever need us, check us out there.